Welcome to today's lecture. My name is Mike Short. I'm a professor of engineering within UCL, but I also work part-time with satellites, and I've had a long-standing career working with UCL on areas of digital technology, but also having worked in the mobile industry for a long time. I thought I'd cover today areas to do with the mobile economy based on some recent evidence from the GSM Association that represents mobile operators around the world. I'll try and include information about the growth of mobile, how it is relevant to looking at biosciences generally, but also how it's relevant to think about international coverage, choices of technology, and usage patterns. We can see that we already live in a digital world, but it's growing very fast, and this information should be very helpful for your studies and your research in terms of understanding how your research fits the digital world. The first source I will use is the GSM Association, and all the other sources will be referred to at the end of the slide presentation. But the first source is called the Mobile Economy 2024 report that was released in February this year. It's also very useful in terms of giving some view of customer numbers and the size of the mobile market, which is opening up a much wider market for mobile wearables, mobile diagnostics, and even some Internet of Things, as we call it, connected things, which could be very useful for future diagnostics and data analytics. We often think about smartphones as the beginning of the journey for mobile economy, and having worked in mobile for 30 years, mainly with Virgin Media O2, but also internationally, we can see the international adoption already exceeds 12 billion connections globally. In other words, more phones than people globally around the world. Not everybody has a smartphone yet. Some have basic phones or simple phones, but there's an increased use of connected sensors, which will also be included in the IoT, Internet of Things figures. We also see that the convergence of computing and communications is opening up new ways of handling data analytics, connected data to do with one's health conditions, but also the evaluation of the environment. Sensing of the environment is expected to be a growth area, whether it's to do with animals or the environment more broadly. This is a very busy chart, so I'd just like to pick out a few numbers from this. It's in the Mobile Economy report itself, and what you can see is the top left-hand side, the unique mobile subscribers or customers around the world using either basic phones or smartphones. They're unique and called unique quite simply because some people have more than one device. So the area below, called SIM connections, is where there are more than one subscriber because they've got more than one device, but they're not unique. So I have a car phone, I have a work phone, and I have a home phone. So I have 3 connections, or SIM connections as they're called. But the total at the end of 2023 shows 5.6 billion unique customers, expected to rise to 6.3 billion unique customers by the end of 2030. If we take all connections, so people with more than one SIM or subscriber identity module, we can see that rising to 9.8 billion cellular connections. Clearly, not all of these are smartphones, so if we look to the right-hand side, we can see smartphones rising from roughly 78% of the unique customers to around 91%. Smartphone is the main form factor today at 78%, but is not in the hands of everybody yet. We define a smartphone as typically the capability of accessing the internet with a large screen so you can see what is on the internet. But the 91% is expected to be reached by 2030. We can also see in the black box marked mobile internet users a rise from 4.7 billion to 5.5 billion. Now that clearly indicates that not everybody has access to the internet, and particularly when you go to some parts of Africa or South Asia or Latin America, you do see an internet gap, people who do not have the full smartphone functionality to access the mobile internet. We also are moving in transition from what's called typically a 4G mobile world, 4G networks, to a 5G world. And we can see in the white box marked 4G that's expected to be around 59% in 2023, but to decline to around 35% by 2030. One of the main reasons for that is there is a lot more investment now, new investment now, going into 5G networks. The primary difference that most people think about is if you have a 5G handset, you may be able to address speeds up to 1 gigabit per second. Typically with 4G, you may get up to 10 megabits per second, but you could reach 1 gigabit per second with the 5th generation. That is expected to rise from 18% of the total unique customers at the end of last year to around 56%. So the majority of the global mobile customers are going to be represented by 4G and 5G, 35% plus 56%. That's important to understand because that talks about the capability of the networks. It also talks about the capability of speed and different generations, but it also means there's an effect. Particularly a 5G handset might be more expensive as a device than a 4G handset. There are also some numbers shown in there about the size of investment, the amount of global funding. One of the shocking figures is you might not realize that the employment in the mobile industry was around 19 million jobs. 19 million jobs around the world is a huge figure, but that is expected to have an impact which creates a further 16 million indirect jobs on the global economy. Huge contribution to GDP, or gross domestic product, rising from $5.7 trillion to $6.4. And without dwelling on this slide for too long, because you can read it at your leisure, the Internet of Things, in other words, not smartphones, but things that are connected, such as sensors, are going to grow faster in this period of 2024 to 2030, when we expect a rise of 3.5 billion connected cellular IoT connections, rising from 3.5 to 5.8 billion. So if we think about the sensors that might use either 4G or 5G, that is expected to grow quite dramatically in the next 6 years. Now that's an important baseline to use when thinking about how does digital health evolve. If, for example, we have more digital diagnostics devices that will connect with smartphones, you can see how much 4G and 5G is in place. You can also imagine if there are connected sensors in the environment, how many wearables might be in use. You can also imagine how much sensing could be done in the home as opposed to in the hospital. So different ways of dealing with digital health will emerge with more connectivity, more computing, and also more coverage. I don't propose to look at this by region, but in detail we've got the geography, because geography does differ. So if, for example, you're doing work in Asia Pacific, it's quite important to look at the blend of the generations of mobile, 2G, 3G, 4G. That is quite different to comparing it with Western Europe or China. Some countries, some regions are more advanced. So may I suggest at your leisure, you look at the balance of the mobile generations of 2G, GSM as it used to be called, 3G, 4G and 5G. And you can see from a geographic point of view how there are differences around the world. If we look at it globally again, though, it's quite important to think about the coverage gap, the usage gap, and the connectivity. The connectivity typically relates to the 4.72 billion unique customers I've described earlier on, but we can then see that there are some customers that don't have access to the internet or the content that is relevant to what they may need. So if they want to access health records on the internet, or if they want information about health, it's quite important that the usage on the internet is in the local language. It's quite important that the content is relevant to the user. So we typically call that the content gap. And there are a large number of customers who don't have access to the internet, but even if they do, they may not have access to the right language content or the relevant content. There is also something called the coverage gap. So when we think about where mobile phones exist, yes, they are global, but in remote and rural areas, there are often coverage gaps. Some would say in cities there are coverage gaps. Some would say indoor. But generally, it's a small percentage of the customer total that experience the coverage gap. So it's quite important to look at the black baseline of 4.72 billion as being connected, but also then think about how usage and content in the digital health area needs to evolve to be relevant for the usage gap to be filled, and then also the coverage gap needs to be filled, particularly for remote and rural areas. Coverage is always measured by where people live and work. So it doesn't typically include the sea, it doesn't typically include the really remote areas like the desert. So it's bound to be the case that the coverage gap would increase as a percentage if we thought about the sea and the desert and the really remote areas. The definition of coverage here is very much where people live and work. Over time, as I said already, the adoption of the generations will change. Already in some countries, 2G GSM has been switched off in favor of moving the radio waves to 4G or 5G, the higher generation smartphones, if you like. It's also the case that 3G has been switched off in some countries, but that's still not in many countries, but it's likely to be the case in the UK that we see 3G switch off completed by the end of 2025. 2G is likely to be around until 2030 to 2035 in Europe, maybe a little longer in other parts of the world. And the later generations of 4G are giving access to the remaining 2G and 3G as long as they're alive. The handsets for 4G and 5G tend to be backward compatible, but will only work if those earlier generation networks, 2G and 3G, are still alive. So you can see from this particular chart, the expectation is that customer numbers will be barely 1% on 2G by 2030. That's changing away. A lot of Internet of Things are being designed to be more in favor of 4G and 5G. In terms of 3G, we can see that's being around 8% by the year 2030 globally, but the 4G around 35% and 5G around 56%. So whenever you're designing solutions, which may be in the digital health area or the diagnostics area, it's quite important to say which networks are live and when and for how long, because of the 2G, 3G ramp down by 2030. If we look at the leading 5G markets, the larger percentage by 2030, we can see that the Gulf Cooperation Council and the GCC Arab states are in the lead. That's because they have relatively low population density, but rather generous investment plans and spectrum allocations. Some parts of the developed Asia Pacific, particularly including Australia, Japan, and South Korea and Singapore, are only in second place there, with around 296 million 5G connections expected by 2030. North America is moving very fast, hence the black bar before the red bar within North America, but we can expect to see 443 million 5G customers by 2030 in North America. As we know, in digital health, a lot of investment will come from North America, so it's quite important to follow what North America will do, even if the Arab states or developed Asia Pacific countries are in the lead. Greater China, as shown by the black bar here, has also had a very fast start, with distinct encouragement by the Chinese state to really roll out 5G quickly. And if we take the numbers, they're expecting 1.69 billion customers using 5G by 2030. But they're not far off 1 billion customers using 5G today. So when we look at the macro level figures, the customers today up to the end of 2023 are in black, but the expectation by 2030 is that they would reach the end of the red bar for each of these rows. Europe is not doing badly. Clearly the black bar and the red bar are shown there, but we can see around 654 million 5G customers by 2030. Some of the more emerging markets might be held back by investment or low GDP per head, low income levels. So we can see Latin America, rest of Middle East and North Africa, Eurasia, other parts of Asia Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa perhaps lagging. So we need to do work to understand when they will have 5G, but the numbers for 2030 are shown on this chart. So that gives you the geography of 5G as well as the switch to 5G. One of the real reasons why there's a lot of investment in 5G is the growth in data. And typically we can see data traffic, not revenue, data traffic leading the way and causing the investment in 5G. So if we look at it in terms of exabytes per month, we can see that from 2023 to 2030, roughly fourfold increase in data globally by the year 2030. And this gives a geographic split where it is. You can see very high levels of usage in Asia Pacific, Europe and North America, and some of the other countries shown there will follow. But it's still a fourfold growth, and it's that growth in data and all things from the internet, all things being sensed, all things being streamed, so much more e-commerce that's driving the data growth. You can imagine from your own personal experience how much time you now spend on social media compared to maybe 5 years ago. That's one area of data growth, but the bigger data growth areas are in things like streaming, particularly off the internet, and catching up on videos or replays. The geographic split in terms of data traffic per connection is also shown at the bottom, and you can see the compound average growth rate 2023 to 2030 also shown there, with the two columns being 2023 and 2030. Again, Europe, where we're based here today, is showing 22% compound average growth rate over the next 7 years. Generally, the rates of growth are all close to 20% or above because it is that huge growth in data. It's no longer a voice-only world, it's much more of a data world. I also thought I should say a little bit about licensed cellular Internet of Things. Now, we can connect things with Bluetooth, with Wi-Fi. This is more about the cellular Internet of Things connectivity. The data traffic I just showed you also will allow for Wi-Fi, but the Wi-Fi data traffic was excluded from those figures. So when we look at other forms of connectivity, we can see other solutions. Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, fixed wireless access would be beyond those figures. But in terms of cellular things that are connected, we can see roughly 3.5 billion things were connected at the end of 2023, and we're expecting that to be 5.8 billion by 2030. Most of the growth you'll see is in China, 1.5 billion new IoT connections in China. A lot of the growth is being seen in North America and in Europe. A lot of connected health objects like wearables, maybe some access to digital diagnostics would be within these figures. But already we can see a lot of wearables and digital diagnostics connected within the 3.5 billion. So this is a major growth area. There are lots of people thinking about end-to-end security to make sure the data can be transferred safely. There are lots of people thinking about how to get data from digital health records into the hands of patients so that they can be treated from home in some cases, or when wearing wearables, with the wearable data transferring from the wearable. A wearable could be something like a smart watch, but it also could be a patch on the skin. It could be other forms of sensors that could be on the body. We've also seen for animals, animal trackers. I would include those as IoT as well. Sometimes animal trackers are used for health monitoring of animals, but also being used more broadly to look at the location of herds, or perhaps certain animals disappearing with their wearables into a remote area. We can also see at the same time, when we put all this mobile cellular and mobile cellular IoT together, that the revenue needs to be given some thought. So you've got a view here of the total revenue and year-on-year growth. The black line really covers the high-income countries, and the red line covers the low and medium income countries. But overall, we can see the total mobile revenue around 1.15 trillion in 2023, likely to rise to around 1.25 trillion in 2030. It's not growing at the same rate as it used to. The right-hand side shows the percentage growth globally, but we can certainly see an average growth rate of around 16 or 17% of revenue growth globally year on year around the world. We can also see much more movement towards apps and applications, and this is being opened up with more open networks. So traditionally, we've seen with SMS and with higher data rate services, the opening up of access to more content. And this is often linked towards open initiatives, such as open gateway initiatives, application programming interfaces. This really talks about it from an industry point of view. This may depend on whether local carrier billing is available, whether the device location can be shared, whether the device status on or off can be shared. It may include areas like number verification for security, one-time passwords for SMS. If we think about areas like mobile money, mobile money in some markets is bigger than the mobile network usage itself. So one-time passwords and security is very important to mobile money and mobile identity to help minimize fraud. We can also see some application program interfaces to look at quality of the network, including the device. We can see capabilities to swap the SIM, the subscriber identity module, so you can change phones or take your SIM out from one phone and put the SIM in another phone. Those are areas of open APIs which are becoming more prevalent, and as we see more and more apps in the app stores, we would expect to see open gateway APIs to support them. I'd like to now just say a few words about satellite. So all of what I said so far is about the cellular world, but we're seeing more convergence, not just with Wi-Fi and cellular, but also between cellular and satellite. It's best if I explain it in terms of the different orbits and the different capabilities, but what we're going to see is a lot more capability for remote and rural areas, but also over the sea using satellite. Satellite is less suited for city services and is less likely to do a lot beyond weather and Earth observation for health. So we typically see a terrestrial network like a base station. It may have as little as 50 meters height above the ground that it can reach. The diameter of a cell site may be as much as 20 kilometers, but it's typically not geared towards the vertical axis. It may reach up to 50 meters. So if you want to make a phone call on a plane, it's less likely to be cellular direct to Earth. It may be cellular from the plane to the nearest satellite, but it's unlikely to be direct to Earth. The exception being is when you're landed at the airport, yes, you can make a phone call from within the plane in some cases, if the airline lets you. But what we can see in the vertical axis are what are called non-terrestrial networks, including UAVs and drones, including HAPS, high altitude platforms, but also low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and global Earth orbit, or geostationary, as it's sometimes called. And you can see the different heights. Drones typically would go up to 100 meters, maybe slightly higher in some exceptional circumstances, but you wouldn't want the UAV or the drone to go into the line of sight of an aircraft or to touch an aircraft. The high altitude platforms could be between 10 and 20 kilometers above the Earth. So they're more likely to have a bigger footprint in terms of what they can see of the Earth, but a bit like the drones, they might be filming the Earth, filming it for weather, pollution, but even land planning. And we see a lot of drone UAV work, but also more recently some HAP work to do with that land planning area. LEOs, MEOs and GEOs, by contrast, can help with communications. So we can start to see more combined mobile phones based on base stations on the Earth with LEO satellites where you might combine the two. Now, if we take all satellites, LEO, MEO and GEO, there are roughly 250 million customers around the world using satellite for communications today. And that's expected to rise to around 500 million by the year 2030. It's also expected to have more satellite IoT connectivity to things on the ground. Again, LEO, MEO and GEO is more to do with Earth observation rather than just communications, but they're very useful for filming what is down below. So a city or a new railway line, very useful for Earth observation beyond traditional weather forecasting. We will see a lot more attention on broadband from LEO in particular, and some of you may have heard of OneWeb, maybe some of you have heard of Starlink, and we will see increasingly in the years to come more broadband services from space, but they tend to be more for remote and rural locations or over the sea. The 250 million customers today that are served are largely served by the big GEO satellites that can see a lot of the Earth. So you can imagine being rescued from a liner or a ship, or maybe some other things that could be at sea, such as a yacht. You can imagine geo-based communications may be helping the marine industry and may have some benefits for monitoring emergencies or health from that remote area. But LEO tends to be stronger when it comes to thinking about broadband services as complement to mobile. We can also see other examples of partnerships between telecoms companies and satellite or NTN companies. This is a list here, but you can see some fairly famous names here, such as Vodafone working with Project Kuiper, such as Telefonica working with OneWeb and Starlink. It does depend on the country. You can see the market or geography shown there. But what's also interesting is the number of mobile connections each of these companies has got, and you can see that listed in the last column. May I suggest you have a look at that for reference? Within the satellite world, there is less, as I said earlier on, of the digital health arena. We can also see, going back to mobile, a lot more to do with UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm very pleased that the GSM Association that provided these figures, I used to be chairman 20 years ago, they produce this annual report every year. And what you can see is the change from 2015, the black line shown there, through to the improvement over the time of 2016 to 2022. One of the amazing things is that all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are being monitored from a mobile progress point of view, because mobile touches all of them. And if we look at some of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we could pick out health or water and some other environmental factors should you wish. But the fact is that they're all progressing towards the 2030 UN SDG targets in a very positive way. Will all the targets be met in terms of UN SDGs by 2030? I don't know, but we can see the progress there. Please do look at this SDG report in more detail and look at next year's version next February. We can also see different usage around the world by activity and the related SDGs. So the top area may not surprise you, but visiting social networking sites or watching free video tends to be one of the highest areas of usage. But when we look at what UN SDGs it touches, category 4, UN SDG 4 comes out strongly, but we can also see SDG 10 and 16. Again, look at those usage factors more liberally. You can see references third from the bottom to improving and monitoring health. That already is in the hands of some people using mobile and smartphones for health monitoring. And that's roughly 2 billion already by the end of 2022. So clearly some strong links to SDGs 2 and 3. Again, please read those SDGs and the usage patterns at your leisure. So when we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we can see that getting better connectivity helps those UN Sustainable Development Goals. But also then we need to look at it by low income and middle income. And you've got some figures here which says how are the mobile connectivity and investments helping people in low income and middle income countries, how maybe they're helping diversity, so helping to get more women involved with mobile and mobile internet, how are they helping with trade and the economy. This gives more detail should you need it. We can also see the mobile internet connectivity in a bit more detail. I said earlier on, not everybody has a smartphone. But if we go back to 2015 and look at it over time through to 2022, you can see how this has progressed. So the red bar is that part which is connected. The green bar is that usage gap I referred to earlier on. And the grey bar is the coverage gap. You can see that the usage gap is narrowing as we see more and more smartphones in use and more relevant connectivity on the internet for a given geography. We can also see that the coverage gap has narrowed. Again, this is defining coverage based on where people live and work. So overall, mobile internet connectivity is contributing to UN SDGs by narrowing the usage and coverage gaps. We can also see that when we look at rural areas, sometimes they have homes a little bit like this. So they may not have reliable energy. So one of the factors which affects coverage gaps and usage gaps is, do they have reliable energy or not? Clearly a mobile phone is powered by electricity typically, which is often charged and recharged, but we have to look at the different rural locations. This chart is taken from the Mobile Internet Connectivity Report to convey the different types of housing for rural areas. This talks about mobile internet by geography and by region. Again, it has the same three metrics of connectivity, red, usage gap, green, coverage gap, grey. So you can start to see the global totals that are shown here top right, 57% connectivity, 38% usage gap, 5% coverage gap at the end of 2022, and then you can see it split by geography. So the worst coverage gap is currently as maybe no surprise to you, sub-Saharan Africa. The second worst coverage gap is in Latin America and the Caribbean, understandable with all the water around the Caribbean islands. But if we then look at the usage gap, we can start to see that the highest usage gap problem is in sub-Saharan Africa as well. The second highest usage gap is in South Asia, particularly in those bigger countries south of China and Japan. So progress has been made. Mobile phones didn't exist before 1983 or 4, but actually here we are in 2024, and we've come a long way in the last 40 years or so. We can see how mobile internet connectivity by region has improved. If we look through to 2020 to 2022, you can see the red bar, higher connectivity in North America, quite high in Europe. But again, sub-Saharan Africa, it's progressed, but has still got some way to go. And it's when you look at the coverage gap, as opposed to the connectivity gap, the coverage gap, that's when satellite may come in more fully. The usage gap, though, is more a matter for content and applications, including health. We can also see that by age group, if we look at the mobile connectivity amongst adults aged 18 and above, this is an interesting perspective because it removes the population of children. So you can start to see that the red bar gets so much higher when you remove the people under the age of 18 from the chart. We can also see the state of connectivity and the usage gap broken down by a device. And device type is important. So most people are connected with a smartphone today, 49%. But there is a good 8% that have connectivity with a basic phone. There are some in the global usage gap that have a smartphone but is not connected. It's left in a drawer. Maybe some have a different type of ways of connecting to the internet. So they use perhaps a personal computer or a laptop, maybe a Wi-Fi connection through a Wi-Fi store. Some have no device at all, 26%. But some have that coverage gap where there is no network available. We can also look at it in terms of how we combine it, in terms of the device, and please read this particular chart at your leisure. We can also look at the smartphone ownership of mobile internet users by technology. This, at your leisure, breaks out the 3G, 4G and 5G story, should you need that at your leisure. And lastly, if we look at some particular countries that have a smartphone ownership deficit, we can particularly look at some big countries as shown here for Africa, Asia and Latin America. So we can even see that in places like Egypt, for urban and rural, that has risen, respectively for urban to 78% and for rural to 52%. For Ethiopia, just for rural, it's still low at 10%. That's largely because they haven't had widespread mobile communications in Ethiopia in rural areas. In Ghana, in Kenya, you can see the rise there in rural areas, but generally urban areas are well provided for, but the rural areas have a notable gap. Again, you may wish to choose a particular country and do a deeper dive. There is some more evidence available in that report. If we also look at how people recharge their phones, sometimes they don't have that energy supply, as I said earlier on. You often find people have more attention to the basic needs of energy for heating and cooking ahead of smartphones. So we have to think about how do we balance energy in this area, how do we make sure it's available. I'm nearly finished now, but I'd just like to comment a little bit on the global population by technology and generation. You can see from this particular chart quite a few areas of the world which have no coverage, but that is narrowing as per the light grey bar. But in terms of the rise of 5G and 4G, this is very graphic from 2015 to 2022. You can see how rapidly 4G and 5G investment has taken a share within 100% of the population already served. This then splits it down by geography, and you can see that sub-Saharan Africa perhaps lags because of the difficulty of geography, but also the challenges with GDP. Whereas in places like North America, the third chart down on the left is all 4G and 5G, and already you can see the black becoming the dominant technology by mobile generation. If we look on the right-hand side, we can also see Europe and Central Asia, and you can also see by 2022 how 4G and 5G is becoming the dominant technology. So to nearly wrap up, we also could see the importance of speeds, and I distinguished 4G and 5G earlier on by speed. There are other capabilities we could look at. But if we look at some of the download speeds, top left, and upload speeds, top right, they're not the same. There tends to be more available for uploading than for downloading. That may change over time with streaming. Downloading is very important with streaming. However, the download speeds tend to be higher in higher income countries than they are in the lower income countries. This splits it a little bit by download and upload speeds. We can also see that the mobile internet users have different usage patterns, particularly at least once on a mobile phone, once per day or once per month. The highest type of usage is instant messaging, which infers messaging for social media, but all sorts of access through a smartphone to stay in touch with your loved ones. Clearly, many people make or receive calls online, some make or receive video calls. They're the top three categories. But increasingly, we can start to see the growth in those that read the news, play free games, listen to music. I'm afraid access to health is third from the bottom. So I think there's a lot more work to be done to think about how usage will change when it comes to accessing healthcare from a mobile internet device. What might be heartening is access to government services is second from the bottom, so maybe some work needs to be done in that area as well. Now, this is a very busy slide, but it's my last slide. If you need to know more about the nature of growth in the mobile economy, or the mobile internet, or the UN SDGs, there is quite a lot of resources in the websites that follow this slide. This particular slide is what's called the UN SDG Impact Explorer. And I'm very pleased to say if you click on this particular website, you can see hundreds, even thousands of case studies of how mobile is being used around the world to make a difference to the UN SDGs. So mobile as an investment is no longer just a communications tool or a computing tool. It's helping to make our lives better. Please use these reference materials as you wish. They're all public domain. The websites will tell you so much more and help your research work and hopefully help your studies. So thank you everybody for taking part today. Some of the GSM Association activities are based on data collected by mobile operators around the world, representing all the customers that I've shown you in the slides already. So the main website is www.gsma.com. It's updated every week with news releases, news pieces. But in addition to that, there are significant reports that I've referred to today, particularly around mobile growth for customer numbers and usage, particularly around coverage, particularly around the access to the mobile internet, particularly around mobile money, and then last but certainly not least, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Have a look at these following websites to tell you more.